Dearly redheaded, we are choosing consciousness today to get through this thing called grief. Interesting word, grief. It means love, which makes for a mighty good joke, but I'm here to tell you, there's nothing else. Just joy. And if the big picture tends to bring you down, go crazy once your life goes. Woo!
PTSD. And I guess we'll start with the stress example that I gave you in our previous conversation. Back in the late 90s, I had a client who, he was about my size, but a lot stronger than me. He worked in stonemasonry, fairly tough guy, grew up in tough circumstances. And one day in our office, in my office, he had this delusional belief, and he had had a significant brain injury, and his delusions were probably related to his brain injury. He had this belief that I had been with his girlfriend, and nothing like that had happened, but he had this belief, and I could not convince him otherwise. Kind of like a fixed delusion. And he was getting agitated, very angry. He was standing in the middle of the room with fists clenched, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. But before I get into the rest of this stressful situation, let me back up a minute and talk about a martial arts class. At the time, I had been involved for a couple of years in a Russian martial arts class. And one day we're sitting in a circle, and the teacher asks us, have any of you put your martial arts training into practice in the real world? So I rose my hand. And everyone's expecting me to talk about, some fight that I was involved in. They were going to be disappointed that there was no fight. But I told them this story. So we go back to my office, and I'm standing toe-to-toe with this guy, and I have no idea what he's going to do next. I thought he might throw a punch at me or whatever, push me or whatever was going to happen. Just didn't know. So I had to make a decision at that moment what to do. So my decision was to, and we're literally standing toe-to-toe. My decision was to sit down. So I sat down, didn't say a word. And then he sat down. He didn't say a word. And then he got up, walked out, went down the stairs, slammed the door, and the door made a sort of characteristic sound when it slammed. It was an old building, and there was, the door was somewhat loose. It just made an unusual kind of sound. And he left. I didn't find out where he went until a few weeks later. It turned out that he had walked 9 miles across town to a psychiatric hospital and checked himself in, where he stayed for a few weeks. But here's the point of this story coming up. The next day, 24 hours after this happened, I'm sitting in that office. I'm doing some paperwork. Ordinary day. And I hear downstairs that door slam. Someone walked in and slammed the door. Instantly, I broke out in a sweat, top of my head to the tips of my toes. I mean, drenched with sweat. And I realized that was an acute stress response. I thought it might be him. It wasn't. But it was a classic Pavlov's dog response, a classically conditioned response, or an acute stress response. And if you remember Pavlov's dog, experiments from the early 1900s by the Russian psychologist, well, actually he was a neurologist back then, Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov had noticed, as it was well known in biology, when we're hungry and we see food, we salivate. In other words, the salivary glands in our mouth release saliva as we get ready to eat, see that food. So Pavlov hooked up a dog to an apparatus that could record the production of that saliva. And he would take the hungry dog, show the dog the food, and the dog would salivate. He would pair that food with a ringing bell. So food and bell, food and bell. And then after those pairings a few times, he would take that hungry dog and just ring a bell. And the dog would salivate in response to the bell. The bell had become classically conditioned. The dog associated that bell with food. So, in a most simplistic way of explaining this, that door slam had been associated in my mind with this incident with this young man. An acute stress reaction. Now, that stress reaction did not go away right away. When the young man called me a few weeks later to tell me that he had gone to the psych unit, I had that same stress reaction with the sweat, the whole thing. And he said to me, he wanted to come back and see me. Well, I had no interest in letting him back into my office. But I didn't want to just not see him. So I said to him, I will come see you at your house, which I did. That went fine. So one day I was at his house, and he walked me out to my car when we were finished. And he noticed in my car something that looked like a sword. It wasn't an actual sword. It was a training sword. It had no blade on it. It had a very dull edge. And it was something we just used in our martial arts training. And I explained that to him. I said, it's just a training sword. We use it for the martial arts training. And I explained briefly what I did in the martial arts classes. And he said to me, so that day in the office, you could have kicked my ass. I said, no. I said, you were the one who was insane, not me. I couldn't have kicked your ass. It would have taken 5 people to take you down if you had gotten violent. And I knew that from working in a center back in 1990 where we dealt with a fair number of violent brain injury patients, where if they did get violent and needed to be taken down, you needed 5 people to take someone down. It didn't matter what size they were, but to do it safely, you needed 5 people, one person to hold each limb and 1 person to hold the head. And those are very stressful circumstances. So I said, no, it would have taken 5 people. There was no way that was going to happen. So I told this story to the martial arts class, and the teacher said, but how did you use your martial arts skills? So I said, well, the skill was that I was able to think in that situation. I didn't panic. And the thinking was, if he does attack, maybe there's a defensive maneuver I could make that would allow me to get out of there safely. There wasn't going to be that I was going to pin him and beat him up and call the cops. It was going to be get out of there safely. And I believed, maybe falsely so, that I might be able to do that if he attacked me. So just that belief kept me calm enough that I was able to think it through and say, I think the smartest thing to do here would be to sit down. Now, would I have done something different if I didn't have any training? I really don't know. I have no idea what I would have done. But the teacher agreed with me that, one of the best skills you can learn in any sort of training like that is how to avoid confrontation, not so much how to confront. So, did I develop PTSD from that incident? No, I had what's called an acute stress reaction. Now, what if those stress reactions didn't go away? And what if they expanded to other things? What if I started to become fearful of other doors slamming, or a year later, I'm still having problems when doors are slamming. Now we're talking about something like PTSD. And when we deal with certain types of stressors, one incident can cause that condition that we call PTSD. The worst type of stressor that in about 80% of cases will cause significant PTSD symptoms is rape. A person who is raped, about 80% of the time, they may not develop full-blown PTSD, but they will at least have some significant post-trauma symptoms. It's one of the worst stressors that you can have. It's even worse than combat stress. Now, all of these are within degrees. So a person can be in combat or in a combat zone in the military, and they can be in an area where there has been death and destruction, and there can be a lot of fear associated with that, and they can develop PTSD from that. Or they can be in continuous combat. Now, the last time large amounts of American soldiers saw continuous combat over months and months and months was in World War II. And it's generally estimated that about 95% of World War II soldiers who went through continuous combat over months, marching through Europe, just conflict after conflict, developed PTSD symptoms. Maybe not full-blown PTSD, but at the very least, significant post-trauma symptoms. I want to talk for a minute about the difference between what happened to World War II soldiers versus Vietnam War soldiers in terms of dealing with trauma.
All right, Bob, let's stop this episode and lead with that.
You could just
Okay.
you could just go right into
All
it.
right,
I'm just going to we'll just break this up into like 3 parts.
Okay.
So just
Okay.
keep rolling.
Go for it, Bob.
Great. So we're talking about the effects of trauma, and some of the processing that's done right after trauma versus treatment that a person may be involved in months or years later. And when we talk about processing immediately after trauma, I do like to use the example of combat veterans in World War II versus Vietnam. And we can talk about what might be called acute treatment, the positives and negatives of that. And there are some significant negatives with that. We'll talk about that too. In World War II, soldiers were subjected to relentless stress. It wasn't like today where you have maybe a 1-year deployment and you come back home. They were there for years, and they were not going to come home until the war was over. And they were marching through Europe, through mud, through highly unpredictable situations, through being shot at, etc. And after the war, they came home. But in World War II, they came home on ships. And it took a while to cross the Atlantic to get home to the United States. And during that time, the guys just shared stories with each other. They talked and they talked and they talked. And that experience was probably pretty effective in addressing some of their short-term traumatic reactions, because they were with guys that shared the same experiences. And they were kind of forced to be with them in close quarters on the trip home. Well, they weren't forced to talk, but a lot of them did so anyway. And they came home to a very admiring public. Admired face-to-face, admired on radio. This was still before television. Admired in the newsreels. Admired when they went to the drugstore. And all of that assisted World War II veterans in returning to society after the war. Now, many still had post-traumatic symptoms, but this whole process alleviated a lot of that for them. Vietnam was much, much different. This was an unpopular war. When troops were pulled out, they got on a plane and they were flown home. There was no processing, or what's sometimes called debriefing. There was no discussion with fellow soldiers. And when they got off the plane, especially in places like San Francisco, to a lesser degree New York, people threw things at them, called them names. They really did call them baby killers. I've heard that from Vietnam vets because I do some evaluations with vets. And it was a pretty horrible situation. So a lot of the Vietnam vets kind of just buried it. They just didn't talk about it. They just zipped up. And some of them didn't really start talking about PTSD or even showing the overt symptoms until they retired, which was maybe 30 years later. And during that time, there was a lot of substance abuse, a lot of self-destruction, some incidents of aggression against other people, but largely self-destruction, largely through alcohol and sometimes through other drugs as well. Some of which they had got hooked on while they were in Vietnam, like heroin. So this knowledge led some people to believe, well, after a stressful incident, why don't we, go in with a team of psychologists and fix people before they get a chance to get PTSD? Well, it was well-intentioned, but ultimately a wrong-headed idea. Because after a traumatic incident, and like, for example, a major house fire where people lose everything and, the fire department is there and people are highly stressed. Most people in those situations don't want to talk to a shrink. They want to talk to family. In some cases, if people are affiliated with a church, they want to talk to a priest or minister. But they don't want to talk to a therapist. So there was a period, and I'm going to say this was about sometime in the mid-1990s, where these debriefing teams were set up that involved mental health professionals, and they kind of attended emergency scenes to interact with people who had just suffered trauma. It was a miserable failure. It just flat out did not work. And I had gone through that debriefing training back then. And I remember a meeting in which we were talking about preventing mental health problems among recently arrived refugees from, war-torn regions and such, people that were given sort of emergency asylum by the government here. And we were talking about a particular group, and I can't remember the details, but I think it was an Eastern European culture, maybe after the war in Yugoslavia. That's what I'm thinking it was. And we were talking about the people, their culture, etc. And I remember raising my hand in the group and saying, they don't want to talk to us, and especially it would typically be through a translator. This particular culture, they're going to be best off talking to a member of their church, because a lot of them were church affiliated. And that was my belief at the time. And I think for this particular group, another group may not be interested in talking to a clergy. But whether it's clergy or just some other trusted person, that's what's probably more beneficial as a debriefing. If you're going to do something like preventing post-traumatic stress after a stressful incident. In other words, if you catch it in time, if you nip it in the bud, so to speak. Bringing a stranger therapist into the situation proactively is probably not a good idea. The only way I would see it being a good idea is if the person who experienced the trauma was to request that. Then I think it would work. So I guess that's what I have to say on the issue of this prevention or proactive approaches regarding stress. But I think, Joanne, you were interested in some of the brain effects. Is that right?
Well, you have me going in 65 directions. I am glad that this is very different from what we talked about the other day, which is fine. But and I appreciate it. But it's putting it's putting me in a different headspace about it. I am thrilled that I can make an analogy based on what you just said, that my interest in the work that I'm doing to spare grief and incite joy matters. Just not when it comes to PTSD, but when it comes to C-PTSD. Trying to be the voice and the ears for people that are on the path and want to work through that monster. I don't want anybody to have to spend as many years healing from C-PTSD as I did.
Right.
It was an inordinate amount of time, and again, you also said it earlier. This neurobiology and neuropsychology components, more so neuropsychology, is still fairly new, and the trickle.
It is, and the neuropsychology is still a profession that is does testing. Testing to look at memory function, this executive decision-making function, perceptual types of functions. It's not necessarily geared toward rehab. There are some neuropsychologists that do rehab. It's not just me. If you go to a brain injury rehab center, there typically will be neuropsychologists on staff that are doing rehab. But if you look at the private practice of neuropsychology, probably 80 to 90% of them are primarily doing testing. So it still is primarily a testing specialty, not so much a rehab specialty.
Oh,
I think that's changing over the years, but that's where it is right now.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it or not, I like to be corrected. Our experience with PTSD is giving us insight into C-PTSD. But it's vast.
Well, it is. It is. Let me make a couple of comments about PTSD and CPS and C-PTSD and the how there are differences, but they're also the same. And let me explain what I mean by that. The original definitions of PTSD, which were developed in the 1980s, sort of required, which is kind of ridiculous when you talk about these diagnoses, but it required that a person experience a life-threatening event.
Right.
Okay. And it could be one event, it could be a bunch of events. So when we talked about people that were subjected to years of subtle emotional abuse, no one thought in terms of PTSD. Where was the trauma? Where was the car accident? Where was the being shot at? Where was the sexual assault? You didn't have any of that stuff. How could you have PTSD? But the definition of what is post-traumatic stress disorder has changed now to incorporate C-PTSD, which is sort of a chronic or continuous stress.
Complex.
So so nowadays it's really talked about in terms of this is what encompasses PTSD, a long-term response to trauma. The trauma could have been one incident. The trauma could have been 150 incidents. All right. And the 150 incidents, none of which may have been life-threatening. They were just threatening to the emotional value of the individual, just day after day after day after day. And one of the things we talked about the other day was we are built to respond and then recover from acute stressors. So the example that people often give is, if you're a caveman thousands of years ago and you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, that's a horrible, terrifying, life-threatening experience, but you tend to recover from it fairly quickly, and you're back out in the woods either the next day or the next week or whatever. We have an acute stress reaction, we recover from it, and life goes on. But if you're subjected to death by 1,000 pinpricks, where it's you're living with a spouse, just to give a domestic abuse example, and you're subjected to daily humiliations,
Covert.
all verbal, all verbal,
Covert.
yeah. Let's say there's no physical contact, there's no assault or anything like that. It's just humiliations and put downs, day after day after day after day. We're really not built biologically to recover from that. We have a stress reaction, it might settle down, but then we get pricked again and again and again and again. And what that does, it starts to just eat away at immune system function. And it creates things like chronic inflammation. It drives us to behaviors that affect our biology more. We start to eat foods that promote inflammation, which is any kind of a junk food, whether it's potato chips, sweets, ice cream, heavy starchy type things, things we shouldn't be eating. We don't have to go into a whole dietary thing, but just junky things that make us feel good in the moment. So it not only affect the abuse, and like you said, covert abuse, sort of seemingly mild if it only happens once abuse, but not so mild if it's every day. That abuse not only by itself affects immune function, but drives us to negative behaviors that kind of add to that and make us sick. And we're more likely to just become ill. Whatever viruses or bacteria are floating around in the air are likely to get us more, the stressed person more than the relaxed person.
And what does that chronic abuse, and I just want to say that give me a second. I got to regroup. I think in pictures and it's hard to convert to words, but what does that do to the brain? We the manifestation of illness, the manifestation of bad habits, serial sedation, addiction, got it. But what does that serial type of abuse, the pinpricks or knives to the heart, knives to the soul, what does that do to the brain?
It's nothing you're going to see on an MRI or a CAT scan. It's possible that you may see something on some of these functional types of scans. But remember, when I talk about things like inflammation, it's systemic, meaning body system wide. All right. It affects blood flow. And so what does all that mean? You're going to have global impairments. Does it shrink the brain? No, you would see that on the scans. So whatever it's doing to brain function is going to be subtle. It's not going to come up on the scans.
All right, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm like a little bit like a dog with a bone here.
Yeah.
We were able to speculate, or in my case, and I just want to, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the scans that show activity, typically in red, blue, and yellow, I don't remember if you knew for sure or you were speculating that someone who has had long-term dissonance or dissociation would be largely, it would show up blue. It actually is like an inactivity response.
Well, I think you might get patterns that are different from the norm, it wouldn't be just all blue. The person would be, this close to being in a coma at that point.
Well,
so no,
more blue.
it wouldn't be like that. It wouldn't be like that. But we might be processing information differently. All right. As a simple example of how a functional scan can look at the processing of information, we know that there's discrete parts of the left brain that are more active when we calculate numbers. All right. So if I hook someone up to a functional MRI machine and I ask them to add a bunch of numbers in their head, we're going to see more activity, the sort of orange colors, red colors in that specified area of the brain. If we show them pictures of faces of people they recognize and people they don't recognize, when they see a face that they recognize, we're going to see increased activity, again, that red, that orange, in a particular area of the right parietal lobe, which lights up, activates when we see faces, and particularly faces. There's a particular type of brain damage called prosopagnosia, in which a person can no longer recognize anyone's face, including their own. So that we know that these areas are responsible for certain things. Now, does that processing of information start to differ when a person has been under chronic stress? While I haven't seen studies of that particularly, I would strongly suspect that you start seeing differences in the processing of information. Right? How would that happen? Well, for example, when we look at the normal response to stress, we have the information gathering of stress, and then we have action that is taken. So, for example, you're laying in bed at night and you hear that strange noise. First thing we do is sit up. We prick up our ears and we try to figure out, what is that noise? Is it the HVAC system? Is it a burglar trying to get in? Is it the dog?
You are hitting home with this.
Who knows what it is, all right? But what that is the information gathering reaction. As a perfectly normal reaction. When soldiers or martial artists are trained, they're trained in situational awareness. What's going on around you?
Can I
Gather
interject?
the information.
Can I interject?
Yes.
This is something I would share with you personally, and I had, at the point where my C-PTSD, it wasn't. It's going to sound like it was controlling me, but it was actually at the point that I felt safe.
Okay.
I had taken off my panic button, which I think I wore for about 2 years, and I had taught, this is a story about my 2 dogs. I had taught my dogs inadvertently to respond to sounds.
Okay.
One would listen, the other would bark if needed. Sometimes they didn't. They knew that I would escalate if I moved out of bed. So they would stay. One would go and patrol. One would listen, and they would only bark simultaneously if it was, like a bear or something significant. It was unbelievable what these 2 dogs were able to salvage as far as my stress.
It's almost like the dogs were assisting you in the information gathering push.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to figure out what we had created, but it was a long time coming. Yeah. And I could go on about that, but I don't want to make this about me.
If we take that to what the brain processing would be different in a person with PTSD versus a person without. During the information gathering portion, there's going to be increased activity, and I'm going to just guess in the frontal lobe. because we are strategizing. We're gathering information to make a decision. We're using higher level cognitive skills. And that information gathering will lead to some form of action. We might call 911. We might walk downstairs. We might go and explore. We might hide under the bed. But hopefully, we make an intelligent decision. If we have PTSD, we don't have trained dogs to help us. That activation is probably going to look different.
Yeah.
It may not involve as much frontal lobe because we might bypass information gathering and go right to panic. And the panic might be, we just go right under the bed. We're not going to explore. We're not going to call 911. We're not going to rationally think it through, thinking, oh yeah, it might be the HVAC system. Oh, maybe I left my refrigerator door open and there's a little bit of an alarm going off there. All of that is not even thought of. We're just diving under the bed. Okay, that's going to look different in a functional brain scan if we had the technology and we're hooked up to the machines at that moment. All right, so we're going to process the same situation differently. A lot of the combat veterans, and this has kind of become a stereotype, but you do hear it over and over again, they'll talk about having to have their back to the wall in a restaurant.
Yeah, I remember that.
Even,
that was
there's
me.
even been books, right? There's even been
that.
books written. I've always had my back to the wall, and you'll see it. You'll see it over and over again. Situational awareness. There are situations in which it's perfectly normal and adaptive to have your back to the wall, and there's others where you probably don't need to do that. But if you're hyper vigilant, a symptom of PTSD, right there in the book, hypervigilance, then you're going to be vigilant everywhere. And that's not adaptive because it creates a heightened level of anxiety that probably doesn't need to be present. Okay, hypervigilance is an important adaptive function. If we find ourselves walking down a back alley in an unfamiliar neighborhood, we probably should be hypervigilant if it's late at night. We should be very aware of what's going on around us. But if we're just going to the corner store in a very familiar neighborhood and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's a well-known safe area, we probably do not need to be hypervigilant. And if we are, we're generating a lot of anxiety that probably doesn't need to be present.
Can I say something again? And this is our first conversation, and I do hope we have more. But the hypervigilance with C-PTSD, in my case, was rational because of the way I was threatened.
Okay, yeah.
So I had to learn how to feel safe despite those threats that were real.
And I don't know if you experienced it. No, this doesn't need to be a therapy session, but there could have been all kinds of examples in which the hypervigilance was necessary and rational to keep you safe. And the question then becomes, did that expand to situations in which you just didn't need to be hypervigilant, but were anyway?
No, because I had mastered, and it's not a therapy session, but I had mastered OCD as a child, massive OCD. So I applied some of those same tactics to CPTSD and found them very helpful.
Well, and at that point, you can be said to have successfully addressed your PTSD.
Oh yeah,
and that is the goal of treatment of PTSD. I get asked sometimes, is PTSD a lifelong condition? I'm like, doesn't have to be.
No, but and that's where this sparing time and grief and energy, like what I had to teach myself, because we are, I feel, you don't have to agree, very antiquated when it comes to CPTSD. There's a lot of good resources out there, but I was more of a help to myself because I knew I could feel safe. I just had to do a hell of a lot of things to get there.
Yeah. 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 No, in principle, PTSD is a treatable condition. In many cases, a curable condition. And that's not to say that everyone is cured of that condition, even with the best attempts at treatment.
No, my residuals, and we're gonna go into a third episode. You want to?
Yeah.
We're official.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna stop.
Okay.
Brian.
Sounds good.
Brian's. I don't know all Brian's motions yet, but we're gonna stop and we'll resume. Thank you for listening and supporting Natural Born Redhead. If you follow the bouncing balls, please like and subscribe. If you know someone interested in sparing others grief and inciting joy, message me on Facebook or reach out via my website, Natural Born Redhead. J Ma.